Red Ridge Base was a relic of the Cold War, a forgotten outpost perched in the frozen, desolate reaches of Alaska. It was a place the government had built in secrecy, a site where military personnel were trained to endure the harshest of environments and prepare for scenarios that never came to pass. Now, decades later, it stood as a shadow of its former self, with a handful of soldiers rotated in for short shifts, assigned to keep an eye on the place for reasons no one was clear about. It was a base no one wanted to be stationed at, and most soldiers couldn't wait to leave. The long, winding road leading up to Red Ridge Base was cloaked in the thick fog of snow that fell relentlessly throughout the year. When we arrived, the night sky was obscured by heavy clouds, leaving the base eerily dark, with only the flickering lights of the decaying buildings offering any semblance of life. As we got out of the trucks and trudged toward the central barracks, the wind howled like a living thing, biting into our exposed skin. The place felt dead. The trees around us were bare, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes by the constant freeze. It was a kind of isolation that reached into the soul, leaving you feeling as though you were truly alone in the world. Our squad, led by Sergeant Walker, consisted of 6 men: Corporal Jameson, Private Lewis, Private Dixon, and the rest of us who'd been rotated in from Fort Wainwright. Walker was a seasoned veteran, tough as nails and unflappable. He'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and while he didn't say much about those tours, you could tell the man had seen horrors that most of us would never fully understand. He arrived at Red Ridge Base with the same grim determination he had brought to every other assignment. But even he wasn't immune to the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The base was a strange patchwork of old military bunkers, rusty fences, and decaying buildings. Some of them had been abandoned for years, their windows shattered by the unrelenting cold. The central barracks, which we were to call home for the next few weeks, looked like something straight out of a post-apocalyptic film. The paint was peeling, and the lights inside flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the corridors. The very first night we settled in, the silence was almost unbearable. The wind moaned through the cracks in the walls, but beyond that, there was nothing. No sounds of wildlife, no distant hum of civilization, just a cold, empty stillness that seemed to press down on us like a heavy weight. As the hours passed, I could feel my thoughts begin to turn inward, lost in the oppressive atmosphere. We gathered in the mess hall, trying to keep the mood light with some cheap jokes and banter, but there was a tension in the air that we couldn't shake. "It's just a few weeks," Guys Walker said, trying to reassure us. "We're here to keep watch, do some routine drills, and head home. It's going to be fine," but even he couldn't completely hide the weariness in his voice. He'd been here before, and something about this place unnerved him, too. That night, we were assigned to our first shift of guard duty. Jameson was my partner, and we were posted along the eastern perimeter of the base, near the old supply warehouse. The night air was thick with the scent of pine and frost, and the soft crunch of our boots in the snow was the only sound that accompanied us. As we walked, the silence grew oppressive, the kind of quiet where every small sound felt amplified, like something was waiting to make itself known. Around midnight, we heard an odd, whistling sound. It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart hammering in my chest. Jameson froze next to me, his face pale in the weak light of our flashlights. The sound was eerie, almost like a lullaby being sung from the farthest corners of the base. It made no sense. There was no one else out here. No one should be. "Did you hear that?" Jameson whispered, his voice tight. I nodded, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. The sound continued, swirling through the trees and echoing off the walls of the nearby buildings. It was faint, like it was coming from far away, but it was so clear, so deliberate. We strained to hear, but after a few moments, it stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence returned, even heavier now, like the sound had been sucked away by some unseen force. We continued our patrol, but the strange whistle kept playing in the back of my mind. When our shift ended, I didn't say anything to Walker. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and I knew Jameson would back me up if I brought it up. But I could see the unease in his eyes. He was as unsettled as I was, and we both knew something wasn't right about Red Ridge Base. Over the next few nights, the odd occurrences increased. Private Lewis reported hearing footsteps behind him while he was on patrol, footsteps that seemed to follow him but never appeared in his line of sight. Dixon claimed he saw a figure standing in the window of one of the abandoned bunkers, but when he went to investigate, no one was there. Walker wasn't one to indulge in superstition, but even he started to notice the strange things happening around the base. His usual calm demeanor was starting to crack, and he'd be on edge during patrols, constantly scanning the surroundings, as if expecting something to jump out at him. One night, while we were all gathered in the barracks, the power suddenly went out. The lights flickered and then died, plunging the room into darkness. The only illumination came from the dim emergency lights in the hallways. Walker was the first to move, instinctively reaching for his flashlight. He clicked it on, but the beam barely pierced the darkness. We all gathered in the mess hall, waiting for the power to return, but it didn't. And then, in the silence, we heard it again, the whistling. It was louder now, almost as if it was inside the building with us. It swirled around us, bouncing off the walls, drifting down the hallways like a ghostly melody. There was no wind, no draft, it was impossible. But it was undeniable. Something was in the building with us, moving, watching. Everyone fell silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Stay calm," Walker whispered. But his voice was shaky. We all knew that this was no accident. Something was happening, something beyond the base's usual isolation. We huddled together, trying to remain vigilant, but none of us could shake the feeling that we were being observed, that there was something out there waiting for us. The power never came back on, and the whispers continued. Some of us tried to sleep, but the rest of the night passed in uneasy half-sleep, disturbed by the sound of creaking floorboards and distant whispers. The next morning, no one wanted to talk about it. The power came back on, but the eerie feeling lingered. It was as if the base had become a living thing, its presence pressing down on us, suffocating us. That night, Jameson and I were once again assigned to the eastern perimeter. We didn't speak much as we walked, each of us lost in our thoughts. But then, something caught our attention. In the distance, near the old storage building, we saw a light. A faint, flickering glow, like a lantern moving in the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The light was too steady, too deliberate. We crept closer, our breath visible in the cold air. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we moved toward the source of the light. The closer we got, the colder it felt. The air seemed to freeze around us, and the faint smell of something burnt lingered in the air. We rounded the corner of the building and stopped dead. The light was gone. But as we turned to leave, we heard its footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind us. We spun around, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, only the sound of the wind in the trees. Our hearts pounded in our chests, the tension unbearable. We didn't wait to investigate further. We ran back to the barracks as quickly as we could, never looking back. The next day, Walker spoke to us privately. He was shaken. He told us about the history of Red Ridge Base, how it had been the site of classified experiments during the Cold War experiments that no one had ever been able to confirm. Some said that during the height of the Cold War, the US government had conducted tests involving psychological warfare, hoping to break soldiers' minds. And some said that not all of those soldiers made it out. We spent the rest of our rotation in a constant state of fear, each of us waiting for the next eerie event. The whispers grew louder, the footsteps closer. At times it felt like the base itself was alive, a living nightmare that had been left to fester in the frozen wasteland. Walker's warnings echoed in our minds: don't trust the silence. Don't trust the whispers. The night before we were scheduled to leave, Jameson and I were sent to do one last sweep of the perimeter. As we approached the old bunker at the farthest corner of the base, we saw something we couldn't explain. A figure, standing in the doorway, watching us. We froze, our hearts racing, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, as still as a statue, staring into the black void beyond. We called out, but it didn't respond. As we took a step closer, the figure seemed to melt into the shadows, disappearing into the dark. We ran back to the barracks, our minds racing. Had we seen what we thought we had seen? Were we losing our minds from the isolation? But deep down, we knew something was wrong with Red Ridge Base. It was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of those who had been forgotten. We left the next morning, but none of us would ever forget what happened at Red Ridge. Walker, Jameson, and the rest of us carried the scars of that place with us, scars that would never fade, no matter how far we ran. And though we never spoke of it again, we all knew the truth. Red Ridge Base wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting for the next set of soldiers to come and experience its horrors, to become part of its twisted history. The whispers still lingered in our ears, and sometimes, when the wind howled through the trees, we could hear them again, faint but unmistakable. The ghosts of Red Ridge Base. This is the story of a night I'll never forget, a night that still haunts me to this day. It happened years ago when I was stationed at an Air Force base in Louisiana. I'll avoid mentioning the name of the base, but if you've been there, you'll likely recognize it from the details. I was assigned to this base in 2006, and like most new arrivals, I was quickly introduced to its many spooky legends. The stories seemed endless, each one creepier than the last. Some of the guys talked about a man in a top hat who supposedly haunted a long, dark dirt road near the storage area. People would claim they saw him walking that road late at night, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. Others shared tales of a deranged man who had been hit by a patrol car and somehow vanished into the woods afterward. Everyone had a story, and everyone had a warning about the eerie things that happened in and around that base. But my story, the one I'm about to tell you, is about something different. It's about a ghostly little girl who haunts the storage area, a tale that I didn't believe at first, but have since come to fear. It all started on my second night on shift. I was partnered with an airman who had been stationed there for years, someone who knew the base inside out. As we drove around on our rounds, he told me the story of a little girl who had died in the storage area long before we ever arrived. According to him, this girl was visiting her dad one day while he was working on the construction of the storage area. She'd been playing on some of the high beams and structures, not unlike how any kid would. But tragically, she slipped and fell from one of the heights, losing her life. The details he shared were hazy, and I wasn't sure if he was just trying to scare the new guy. Yet there was something in his tone that made me believe he was serious, as if he had been there when it happened. Maybe he just wanted to make a point about respecting the area, or maybe he truly believed the story himself. Either way, he ended up driving us to the very spot where she supposedly fell, a spot that had grown over with weeds and looked entirely ordinary, save for the fact that it was oddly quiet. He turned off the engine and shut off the music, and we just sat there in the stillness. The air felt heavy, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. There was something about the silence that felt off. We stayed there for a few minutes, him grinning, probably hoping to spook me. But nothing happened, and eventually we headed back to finish our rounds. At the time, I shrugged it off as just another creepy story, but I never forgot the feeling I'd had sitting there in the dark. Fast forward 3 years. By now, I was well into my time at the base and knew it like the back of my hand. The storage area was mostly closed down, with only a few sections still requiring routine checks, but I was used to patrolling it by then. That night started off rough. Our regular patrol vehicle was in maintenance, so they handed us a cattle truck instead. A cattle truck for patrol duty, it was laughable, but we didn't have any other choice. The shift itself was slow, and by 4 a.m., it was time for our last check of the storage facility. To access this area, you had to go through 2 massive, heavy gates that took a while to unlock and lock. My partner, who we'll call Alpha, was driving while I handled the flashlight, checking the locks on each structure as we passed by. Everything felt normal as we went through our rounds, and we were chatting, trying to stay awake during those early morning hours. As we wrapped up, Alpha made the final turn onto Echo Street, the road where the girl was said to have fallen. I had driven down this street countless times by then, but tonight, something felt different. There was a sudden chill in the air, and the usual hum of the cattle truck's diesel engine seemed quieter, almost muted. Even the faint sound of the radio was barely audible, like it was slipping away into the stillness. About halfway down the road, I felt a strange sense of dread settle over me, a gut feeling that something was wrong. I brushed it off, focusing on the beam of my flashlight, but then I heard it, the faintest sound, barely more than a whisper. It was a groan, low and eerie, like someone in deep pain or distress. It was soft, almost too quiet to notice, but it sent a chill down my spine. My heart raced as I turned to Alpha. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me, confused, probably thinking I was messing with him. He kept driving, his foot easing off the accelerator as he looked at me. I hear what he asked, but before I could answer, the sound came again. This time, it was louder, a long, mournful groan that seemed to echo through the truck's cabin. Alpha went silent, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. I quickly reached over and turned off the radio, hoping it would bring clarity to whatever we were hearing. The engine's low rumble filled the silence for a moment, and then, clear as day, we heard it again, a chilling, gasping moan that seemed to come from all around us, like it was both inside and outside the truck. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe, their breath coming in long, desperate gulps. "What the hell is that?" Alpha whispered, his voice shaking. We sat there in shocked silence, both of us staring out into the darkness, trying to see if anyone was there. The cattle truck's headlights cut through the night, illuminating the empty road, but we couldn't see a thing. Just when I thought it might be over, the groan came again, louder and more insistent. It sounded closer now, almost as if it was right outside my window. I felt my skin crawl, and I turned to Alpha, who was gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. Without a word, he threw the truck into drive and hit the gas. We took off down Echo Street, the cattle truck rattling over the uneven road as Alpha sped faster than I'd ever seen him drive. He barely slowed down at the curve, nearly tipping the truck in his haste to get away. But we didn't care. All we wanted was to escape whatever was making that horrifying noise. We reached the gates faster than I thought possible, and I jumped out of the truck to unlock them, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the heavy latches. Alpha watched my back, his eyes darting around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Once the gates were open, he sped through, and I quickly locked them behind us before diving back into the truck. We drove back to the main part of the base, both of us silent, still shaken by what we'd heard. When we got back, we went straight to our flight chief. We told him everything, expecting him to laugh us off or say we'd imagined it. But to our surprise, he didn't doubt us for a second. He listened quietly, nodding, and when we finished, he simply said, "I believe you. I've had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same area, and another time near the jailhouse." Hearing him confirm our experience made it all the more chilling. This was a man who'd been on the base for years, someone who'd heard all the stories and seen everything. Yet, he believed us, and that haunted look in his eyes told me he knew exactly what we'd gone through. I returned to the storage area only once more after that, but I made a point to avoid Echo Street. Even in broad daylight, I could feel the tension building in my chest as I passed by. To this day, I don't know what we heard that night, but whatever it was, it left a lasting mark on me. I've told this story many times, but each time I feel the same chill, the same prickle of fear. It's as if that moan, that ghostly groan, is still echoing in the back of my mind, waiting for me to pass by Echo Street one last time,